Monday, 29th of January, 2018. A private jet touches down at a quiet airfield in Hampshire. Nothing unusual on the surface, a small crew, a handful of passengers, and a line of suitcases eased onto the tarmac. But as officers begin their routine checks, something about that luggage draws a pause. Wednesday, 20th of September, 2023. 5 years later, more than 200 miles away, a different team approaches a farm track in rural North Wales. A trailer sits open in the yard, no traffic, no movement, only the sense that whatever has been happening here has been happening for a long time and is about to end. Two crews, two places with nothing in common at first glance, yet each hiding something that would eventually draw investigators straight to them. This is the story of how a luxury flight into Farnborough and a remote farm near Mold became the centre of two of the most significant drug operations uncovered in modern UK law enforcement, and how both finally came undone. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. Before their names appeared in headlines and court records, the four men at the centre of this operation were, by all outward measures, ordinary figures, living ordinary lives. Martin Neal, from Poole in Dorset, made his living as a bricklayer. He had ongoing building work at Sandbanks and was known locally simply as a tradesman who took on construction jobs. Alessandro Iembo, the youngest of the group at 28, worked shifts at the Mary Shelley Wetherspoons pub in Bournemouth and also delivered pizzas for a local company, Victor Franco Lorenzo, originally from Spain, but based in Bournemouth, held various hospitality roles. And José Ramón Migueles Botas, the oldest at 56, was a hairdresser from Valladolid, who had travelled between Spain and the UK for work. Nothing in their employment, lifestyle, or day-to-day routines suggested international crime. The group adopted a posture built around wealth, digital age business, and the music industry, an identity designed to make their movements look legitimate. We will cover each of them in a few minutes. At the centre of that plan was a woman using the name Claire Harris. She approached private jet company Diamante Jets, speaking on behalf of what she described as affluent clients involved in cryptocurrency ventures and music industry projects. She arranged aircraft for them, insisted on specific ground handling companies, and paid entirely in cash. We will cover each of it one by one with each operation separately. The decision to use private aviation was deliberate. Instead of risking scrutiny at major hubs like Heathrow or Gatwick, airports with high passenger volumes and fully staffed customs units, the group repeatedly chose Farnborough, a smaller airfield used for business and executive travel. Farnborough did have border force staff, but nowhere near the scale of larger airports. And across the UK, this vulnerability is well known. More than 3,000 small airstrips exist, many operating with limited on-site checks. Criminal groups often view these smaller locations as easier access points, especially for high-value loads or low-profile movements. But their ordinary lives and borrowed identities were only the surface. Within weeks, the first test run would reveal just how much planning had already taken place and how far the network was willing to go to avoid detection. The events of early December 2017 would later be understood as the rehearsal, the first full demonstration of how the operation intended to move drugs, money, and people between the UK and Colombia without attracting scrutiny. On the 8th of December 2017, three members of the group, Alessandro Iembo, Victor Franco Lorenzo, and Martin Neal, departed Luton Airport aboard a private jet chartered entirely in cash. The booking, made again through the woman using the name Claire Harris, totaled approximately £128,500 paid up front. She insisted that a specific Colombian ground handling company, Central Charter, oversee the aircraft upon arrival in Bogotá. This insistence would later be viewed by investigators as a sign of pre-coordination between UK-based associates and those stationed in Colombia. José Ramón Migueles Botas was missing from this trip. The absence of Migueles Botas on the dry run would become relevant later, showing how roles shifted between flights and suggesting that the December trip functioned as a proof of concept rather than a fully loaded operation. The flight path itself was notable. The return journey included a stop in the Azores, a detail that stood out when later compared to typical private jet routes between Colombia and the UK. But what mattered most was not the destination or the cost. It was what happened when the men returned to Britain on the 11th of December. At Farnborough Airport, they were met by a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce Phantom, a detail that reinforced their manufactured image as cryptocurrency investors and music industry professionals, supposedly traveling to meet singer Bruno Mars. From there, they traveled to an address in Bromley, bringing with them multiple suitcases. None of these were searched by Border Force officers. There was no inspection, no disruption, or detection. The group completed the journey with ease. Months later, when investigators reconstructed the trip, they discovered X-ray images from Colombia showing suitcases packed with large volumes of banknotes associated with that December flight. These images did not surface at the time of travel. They were retrieved after the January arrest and provided critical evidence showing that cash had likely been transported out of the UK. If true, it indicated the December journey was not merely a reconnaissance flight, but a financial exchange tied directly to the larger smuggling conspiracy. That quiet December flight showed the route could work. What followed in January would push the same method to its limit, with new faces, more luggage, and far higher stakes. By late January 2018, the group had already proven that a private jet could complete a full round trip to Bogotá without any meaningful interference. This time, every stage of preparation was more deliberate, more structured. On 25th of January 2018, José Ramón Migueles Botas travelled from Spain to the United Kingdom, taking up accommodation at a Premier Inn in Bournemouth, close to where both Martin Neal and Alessandro Yemba were living. That same evening, all members of the group travelled to the Chelsea Harbour Hotel in London. The stay, like the use of luxury vehicles and high-end transport, contributed to the elaborate narrative they had been cultivating. On 26th of January, luxury vehicles arrived at the hotel to transport the group to Luton Signature Airport. These cars carried the men and a notably large quantity of baggage, 12 suitcases, far more than would be expected for a brief overseas visit. Investigators later emphasized that the scale of the luggage alone created a visual imprint, demonstrating how the operation relied more on confidence and theatrics. Meanwhile, arrangements for flight number 2 were already in place. The booking mirrored the December pattern almost exactly, approximately £138,500 paid in cash, coordinated by the same woman with the same explanation, and handling company on arrival, indicating that whoever coordinated the Colombian end of the conspiracy required a particular ground team. When the private jet landed at El Dorado International Airport in Bogotá, the operation shifted into the hands of the Colombian side of the conspiracy. El Dorado is one of South America's busiest airports, but the group's luggage appeared to pass through a highly unusual chain of touchpoints. Colombian authorities later discovered that criminals in Bogotá had employed a set of coordinated tactics to ensure the cargo moved without conventional scrutiny. Among these elements was an allegedly corrupt airport ground handling employee whose access and authority made it possible for the operation to proceed inside restricted zones. The suitcases themselves were reportedly brought to the plane using armored vehicles. This was not a casual or improvised method. It was a transport procedure typically reserved for high-risk transfers or sensitive cargo. One of the most striking details revealed later by Colombian investigators involved a bogus police officer accompanied by a fake sniffer dog. This imposter carried out a staged inspection of the suitcases before they were loaded onto the jet. This all had a single purpose: to create the appearance of legitimate screening and to dissuade any genuine officer from re-inspecting the luggage. With the performance complete, the bags, now containing hundreds of kilos of cocaine, were reloaded onto the aircraft as if they had passed official checks. The cocaine itself had been prepared and packaged long before the jet arrived. Each kilogram brick was tightly wrapped, highly uniform, and marked with cartel identifiers. Some bore the Superman logo, a symbol frequently associated with particular Colombian trafficking groups. Others displayed an Esco imprint, interpreted by investigators as a likely reference to Pablo Escobar or the broader Medellin legacy. For UK investigators, what happened in Bogotá became crucial in proving the scale and intentionality of the conspiracy. By the time the jet left Bogotá, the suitcases carried far more than clothing. The groundwork laid in Colombia would soon collide with the scrutiny awaiting them in the UK, marking the beginning of the end for the operation. When the jet crossed into UK airspace on the 29th of January 2018, the men on board had every reason to believe the plan was unfolding just as it had weeks earlier on the tarmac. Just like the earlier December run. But this time, Border Force officers had already been alerted to the flight's arrival within minutes. Officers identified several indicators that justified a deeper inspection: the number of suitcases, the inconsistencies in the passengers' stories, and the context of the earlier trip. A selection was made for enhanced checks, and the group were escorted to a search room. What unfolded in that room later became central to the case narrative. Officers opened the suitcases and initially found a scattering of women's and children's clothes, evidently placed there to suggest legitimate travel. Beneath that thin layer, however, lay the reality of the operation. Wrapped tightly in tape and arranged in layers, 513 individual kilogram blocks of cocaine were revealed. The purity hovered around 79%, exceptionally high for a shipment intended for wholesale distribution. The total weight approached a half-ton consignment with a wholesale value of approximately £15.39 million and a potential street value exceeding £41 million, suggested by the report's CCTV footage captured the unfolding discovery from multiple angles. These recordings became some of the most circulated images linked to the case, providing a visual anchor for what had otherwise been a covert, international movement of drugs. Once the first block appeared on camera, the operation was no longer a performance of luxury travel. It had become a clear-cut drug seizure, one of the largest flown into the UK in years, and the turning point from which everything else in the case flowed. By the time officers completed the search at Farnborough, the discovery of the cocaine was only the beginning. What followed was the gradual assembly of an evidential structure that prosecutors later described as clear, deliberate, and increasingly difficult for the defendants to distance themselves from. Much of this spine came from devices seized on the day of the arrests: mobile phones, travel documents, and records of movements that collectively mapped the group's involvement long before the January flight. Among the seized items were multiple mobile phones, some used for routine communication and others reserved for more discreet contact. The most striking of these was the encrypted handset recovered from Alessandro Yembo. It pointed towards a level of security awareness associated with organized networks rather than four men acting independently. Even without full message content, the phone's existence contributed to the prosecution's argument that the group were taking instruction from others situated higher in the chain. Call data analysis provided the next strand. Investigators traced patterns of communication between the men across the charge window of 30 October 2017 to 30 January 2018. Piece by piece, this evidence formed a coherent picture. Communications, movements, behavior at airports, and the almost brazen presentation of the luggage itself. Together, they established a foundation strong enough to support the case that the January seizure was not an accident or a misunderstanding, but the culmination of a carefully planned operation. The case entered Woolwich Crown Court in early 2019, where prosecutors began setting out the full sequence of flights, bookings, and movements behind the smuggling operation. What unfolded across this phase of the trial was a careful dismantling of those explanations. One of the first narratives put forward was the suggestion that the trips had a charitable dimension. Some of the defendants claimed they believed they were traveling on behalf of One Young World, a respected international charity. The idea, they said, was that their presence in Colombia related to youth-focused humanitarian work. But the prosecution quickly established that One Young World had no record, no correspondence, no involvement, and no awareness of any of the men. The defense then turned to the more glamorous narrative. The notion that the men had traveled as part of the music industry and were heading to Bogotá to meet Bruno Mars investigators acknowledged that Bruno Mars had performed in Colombia during the relevant window in December. But beyond that coincidence, no evidence existed of any meeting, invitation, backstage access, studio session, or industry connection. No records linked the men to event organizers or management. The name of the star had been used purely because it sounded credible. Running alongside these broader cover stories was a more personal defense centered on Stephen Neal, who joined the group on the January flight. His team argued he had no meaningful involvement in planning, no insight into the suitcases being moved, and no reason to distrust those inviting him. Ultimately, the jury accepted that the prosecution could not prove he had knowledge of the cocaine. He was acquitted. For the remaining 4 defendants, however, that line of reasoning did not stand. 4 men were found guilty of fraudulent evasion of a prohibition on a Class A drug, reflecting their participation in both the December dry run and the January importation. Neal, Iembo, and Franco Lorenzo were each sentenced to 24 years in prison. Because Migueles Botas only participated in the final January flight and not the December rehearsal, he received a slightly reduced term of 20 years. But the courtroom's decisions did not mark the end of the case. In Colombia, where the suitcases were loaded, authorities launched a parallel investigation. 5 individuals were arrested, with early findings pointing to corrupt access within El Dorado Airport. For the National Crime Agency and Border Force, the case exposed a dangerous vulnerability on smaller airports used mainly for executive travel and not designed for high-volume customs checks, presented attractive gateways for organized crime. And as this case closed, investigators were already facing another operation whose scale and audacity would challenge everything they thought they knew about criminal logistics. From the outside, it looked like just another surge in cocaine appearing across Britain's major cities. But behind the scenes, investigators would soon uncover something far more ambitious, an industrial-scale pipeline engineered from thousands of miles away. Between May and September 2023, a transnational network coordinated from overseas, including command figures based in Dubai, quietly constructed a supply chain that stretched from South America through mainland Europe and deep into the UK's criminal economy. This wasn't a single shipment or a one-off gamble. It was a continuous conveyor belt designed to feed Britain's cocaine market with reliability, volume, and precision. According to assessments later made by the Northwest Regional Organised Crime Unit, the network's objective wasn't modest profit or local distribution. It was sustained national supply, the kind of capacity only the highest-tier criminal infrastructures can achieve. Their working estimate was stark. 2 to 3 tons of cocaine were expected to move through the pipeline, enough to influence wholesale prices across the country. Every long-running drug pipeline needs someone who can move across borders without provoking questions, someone whose routine looks so ordinary that it becomes invisible. In this network, that role belonged to 48-year-old Guy Remington. He traveled alone, driving a specially adapted vehicle due to paralysis, towing a compact trailer behind him. To anyone watching him pass through the Eurotunnel terminals, he appeared exactly as he presented himself, a disabled man running a small, steady cross-channel business. But behind that quiet exterior was the courier the entire operation depended on. Between the 3rd of May and the 21st of September 2023, Remington made 9 trips through the Eurotunnel. Each journey followed the same pattern. He left the UK, crossed into mainland Europe, remained there just long enough for a handover, and returned with the same calm, unchanging routine. There was never any disruption, and his predictability was the camouflage. To reinforce this, he operated under a business front, a simple commercial explanation that justified frequent travel and the use of a trailer. Meanwhile, the true strength of the pipeline lay inside the trailer itself. What looked like ordinary wooden interior paneling concealed the engineered hides that made the whole system work. The construction was basic by design: timber boards, screws, and joinery that blended perfectly into the trailer's structure. Only by knowing the precise points to press or remove could the panels be lifted. There were no electronic switches or welded false floors, no visible signs of tampering. Even a trained officer would have needed specific intelligence to justify taking the trailer apart. Until that moment arrives, we will talk about this in a few minutes. While the couriers were moving product across borders, the real machinery of the UK end was being constructed in North Wales, at a place few would ever have reason to notice: Tirlas, Goch, a remote farm tucked along a thin single-track lane outside Holywell. To most people, it looked like any other quiet rural property: an aging farmhouse, outbuildings softened by weather, fields stretching out towards the tree line. But to Luke Hurst, the 37-year-old tenant who took control of the site, Tirlas Goch was more than farmland. It was the perfect hub for an industrial-scale cocaine distribution centre. He was the man waiting on the UK side, the one who transformed a quiet rural property into a node capable of feeding multiple cities. Investigators would later say he was the organiser on the ground, the coordinator who ensured that whenever product arrived from the continent, it had somewhere safe to land and a reliable system to move outward. From there, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham and beyond were only hours away, remote enough to hide and central enough to supply. But the brilliance of the setup was in the handover method: simple, low visibility, and designed to keep Tirlas Goch almost invisible to anyone who wasn't supposed to know it existed. Customers never arrived at the farm directly. Instead, meetings took place at neutral points. Service stations along the A55 or the quiet stretch of Pinfold Lane Hurst or another trusted member of the network would collect a customer's vehicle there, drive it up to the farm, load it behind closed doors, and return the car to its owner at the pickup point. For months, the system worked exactly as it was designed to, until the perfect day. If Tirlas Goch was the engine room of the operation, the downstream networks were the arteries. One of the key figures in this secondary layer was Thomas Smith, a Liverpool-based distributor in his early 40s. His role was quieter, methodical, and critical. Investigators later found that he made frequent journeys up to North Wales, arriving at predetermined handover points where vehicles were swapped for loading runs to Tirlas Goch. His involvement didn't stop at cocaine. What police uncovered was far more darker, and we will talk about this in a few minutes. In the south, another crucial figure played a very different but equally essential role: Morgan Towner, a 47-year-old courier from Surrey, operated hundreds of miles from the Welsh base, but was still tightly plugged into the same system. His job was to run southbound loads, taking shipments from the farm and moving them deep into the home counties and beyond. The van Towner used looked innocuous, the kind you might see parked outside any tradesman's house, but inside, officers later uncovered a professionally built hidden compartment concealed so seamlessly that even trained search teams missed it at first glance. The linkage between these men became unmistakable when investigators began pulling data from the seized devices. Phones contained message threads referencing drops, collections, and countdown timings that matched to the minute movements captured on ANPR cameras and Eurotunnel Records location logs aligned with known meeting points. Calls pinged from mast to mast along the A55 and the M6 in sync with the journeys traced from surveillance and road cameras. Some messages were coded, others barely disguised, but all pointed in one direction: a coordinated system in which each man understood his role and timing mattered. The device data didn't just fill in gaps, it stitched the entire operation together. It showed that Smith's trips weren't random. For months, these downstream operators kept the pipeline alive, until a single misstep began to drag the entire structure into the light, and what unraveled next would expose just how many miles the drugs had traveled. For months, the Northwest Regional Organized Crime Unit had been watching the movements of the man they believed was the courier at the heart of the pipeline. The pattern was unmistakable, and always towing the same adapted trailer with the same concealed wooden panel hides. 8 runs had already been logged, but it was the 9th run that tipped the balance. On the 18th of September 2023, officers saw once again what they had come to expect: Remington leaving the UK alone, towing the same trailer behind his specially adapted vehicle. The unit didn't just record the departure, they treated it as the final piece of the pattern they had been building. This was the moment investigators had been waiting for. They understood that stopping Remington on his return at the border risked losing the wider network, but allowing him to re-enter the country could lead straight to the distribution hub. And if surveillance was held, they could take everyone involved in the same decisive strike. The plan formed quickly: track Remington upon re-entry, follow the trailer to the farm, and move the moment unloading began. If the network operated as it had for months, then the men on the ground would be waiting for him. And on the 20th of September 2023, that is exactly what happened. Surveillance units were already in position. And then the moment arrived. The trailer was opened and the unloading began. Within seconds, officers moved in. The chaos that followed marked the collapse of the entire pipeline. Inside the trailer and the farm buildings, investigators uncovered what they had long suspected the operation was designed to deliver: an enormous consignment of Class A drugs. By the end of the search, the tally stood at approximately 505 kilograms of cocaine and around 108 kilograms of heroin, a combined street value approaching £64 million. It was one of the largest single mixed drug seizures the region had ever seen. Both Guy Remington and Luke Hurst was arrested on the spot. The hits didn't stop there. In Remington's vehicle alone, officers recovered £183,865 in cash, packed and ready for movement. At the same time, parallel teams executed searches at his home and associated premises. Those raids uncovered more than £700,000 in cash, multiple vehicles, and a collection of high-value assets that made it clear he was no small cog in the machine. This was a courier with deep access, trusted enough to move extraordinary weight and compensated accordingly. But even those numbers were only the surface of what investigators believed the network had achieved. Northwest Regional Organized Crime Unit's assessment, drawn from journey timings, device messages, known loading patterns, and the volume recovered on the 9th run, suggested that the group had already imported 2 to 3 tons of Class A drugs during the earlier journeys at street level. That translated to over £250 million in potential value. The operation, which had run for months with almost mechanical consistency, came to an abrupt stop in a single morning, and the collapse of the pipeline was only beginning to unfold. With the initial arrest, police moved towards the other coordinator of this operation. On the 18th of October 2023, when investigators executed their next strike in Liverpool, officers arrested Thomas Smith. A search of his address revealed exactly the kind of cash they expected: around half a kilogram of cocaine and an additional 9,807 MDMA tablets packaged and ready for onward supply. Ledger entries and device data tied him directly into the pipeline's rhythm and confirmed he was not just a customer. He was a functioning node in the network. The final arrest came on 26th of October in Leatherhead, where Morgan Towner was detained. His arrest closed the last active route out of the farm. By then, the charges were clear. Remington faced conspiracy to import Class A drugs and conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. Hurst, Smith, and Towner were charged with conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, with Smith additionally facing counts related to his seized MDMA and cannabis. On 2nd November 2023, at Chester Crown Court, all 4 men entered guilty pleas. On 21st March 2024, the judge delivered sentences that reflected Not only the seized 613 kilograms recovered during the raid, but the broader architecture of the operation. According to CPS and BBC reporting, the final terms were: Thomas Smith received an 18-year sentence. Guy Remington was also sentenced to 18 years. Luke Hurst was jailed for 12 years, whereas Morgenthaler received a 7-year imprisonment for his part as a courier, a combined 55 years of imprisonment. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.